Perfect. Thanks, Michaela. So as Michaela mentioned, my name is Jackie, and I appreciate all of you taking time out of your days. I know that there's never a perfect time for everyone, but we really tried to make this work with everybody's schedules so that as many people from as many different time zones could log in with us today. You'll also have to excuse me, I'm a little under the weather, so if anyone needs anything repeated or if you have questions about something that I said, please put it in the chat and Cooper will let me know. And I'm happy to do that for you. So, just a brief agenda before I get into an introduction. So, we'll go through who I am, why we're hosting this webinar, um, and then we'll talk about some background, like Michaela had mentioned, about the Supreme Court decisions, what those laws are, and how to use this knowledge during application season, or if you are a genetic counselor or you're a current student or you're just someone who's passionate about helping students and exposure to our field, then how can you use the information that we're going to go over today to benefit everyone? So, like I said, my name is Jackie. I'm a genetic counselor in Dallas, Texas. I graduated in 2021 from the University of South Carolina's genetic counseling program. And I moved back here where I have clinical cancer genetics experience, and then I now work in test utilization management. Um, so if you're thinking that neither of those positions sound like they intersect very much with the topic today, I would say one, you're wrong, but two, I also have a few more hats that I wear. So I supervise current students, I mentor prospective students who are interested in genetic counseling programs or being genetic counselors in the future. And I'm also a mentee, so I'm also continuing to learn from other genetic counselors in the field. So all of those things together does not make me an expert on this subject matter by any means, but I am just someone who wants to share this information so that other people can use it as they see fit. And a special thank you to everyone, all of the genetic counselors that have helped me with this presentation and this information. I really appreciate it, and I couldn't have done it without you. And then, of course, it wouldn't be a webinar without a disclaimer, but this one is really important. Um, it's important to note that I am only speaking from my experience, my information, my knowledge. I will have references and resources throughout this presentation, but I'm not speaking on behalf of any genetic counseling programs or any genetic counselors, any states. This is not legal advice. This is truly just intended to inform people or give you a running start so that you can set yourself up for success if you have questions about these things in the future. But as always, if you have specific questions, if you want to reach out to me, we'll have my contact information at the end, but there will be plenty of people that I give you as resources as well throughout this experience. So when it comes to these laws, I think it is important to make sure that we're all on the same page with what DEI is and what it means in this landscape. So, what we're using it as or defining it as. So, I'm sure most, if not all of us, know DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, just a reminder of what those are. Diversity is like who do we have in the room? Equity is how are we making sure that different people can get into the room? And then inclusion is what are we doing to make sure that everyone in the room has a chance to add to the conversation and collaborate with each other? And then intersectionality, like Michaela had mentioned, that's where all of those dimensions of diversity intersect with each other. So dimensions of diversity can include race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, and many more things. So, just social categories that people might fit into. Most, if not all of us, fit into one or more of those categories. But when someone fits into multiple dimensions of diversity that might already face discrimination or disadvantage, it basically multiplies that effect. So, that's what that means in this case. And then the topic of discussion today is race conscious admissions. So if you have not heard of affirmative action before, It was introduced in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, um, when JFK was president. And basically, it was a race conscious admissions policy that was attempting to rectify some of the discrimination and disadvantages that students of color or people of color were facing in higher education or in the workforce. So there were things like, of course, there's segregation. There were quota systems that said that this is how many people of color can go to this school. This is how many can go to this school. So those things were leading to disadvantages and inequities when it came to pursuing higher education. And that was across the country. Colleges and universities everywhere were experiencing that. So an executive order was signed, which was meant to promote inclusivity and say that regardless of race, color, ethnicity, national origin, everyone should be given equal opportunities to pursue higher education. And this led to the formation of some programs which tried to address those systemic barriers. So underinvestments in schools where people of color were attending, they were getting investments, um, access to advanced coursework, so making sure that everyone was, or trying to make sure that everyone was having access to the same quality of information. And then, of course, removing some of those biases or trying to level that out so that when it came to truly the admissions piece, so who's getting into college, that it wasn't just advantageous to white or wealthy students or applicants. So that sets us up for what's going on right now. And recently this year, the Supreme Court decided that, based on a case that was brought forward by the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina university systems, they decided that those protections were not doing what they were created to do. So instead of leveling the playing field, it was kind of decided that these affirmative action protections or systems were disadvantaging one group for the promotion of another. So they, that was the decision. They decided that we're going to remove those protections. States are no longer allowed to use race as a deciding factor in higher education admissions. Um, So we know that there is a really big impact that could happen, based on removing those protections from affirmative action, as we've seen in states that have already repealed those protections. So there are 9 states that prior to the 2023 decision already were not implementing affirmative action in their higher education admissions process. And in those states, regardless of how elite a university was considered, they were seeing perpetually low enrollment rates for students of color and other underrepresented or minority students. So there is a college system in one of those 9 states where they had as low of enrollment as 2% of individuals identified as Black or African American in their entire freshman class. And we know that that's not representative of what their state looks like, and that was in 2022. So, it's not something that has gotten better over time. It's something that we've seen that this is just not quite adding to diversity and enrollment the way that we want it to. And we know that when we take diversity out or lower diversity in college programs, that's also lowering diversity in the field that those students might have gone into. So some people have introduced other ways to try to make the admissions process more equal or more equitable. And so some of those are wealth or class-based alternatives. And basically what has been shown is that those are still not as effective as race conscious or other diversity conscious admissions processes. So where does that leave us today? Affirmative action was a federal mandate. It's no longer in effect. So in the absence of that, schools, they still have to comply with just basic civil rights laws in from the federal landscape and the state landscape. So current policies and practices, they're by no means trying to unnecessarily limit opportunities based on race, ethnicity, sex, ability, gender identity, anything like that. But there's just no longer the ability to use that as something that we can count on to have a more diverse student population. So in addition to the federal or the nationwide mandate, some states are introducing bills where they are further classifying or restricting how public universities or public institutions can use diversity in their admissions process. So whether that's recruitment or interviewing or admissions funding, those are all things that we'll cover, but that's important to more than just students. It's also relevant to us as genetic counselors because our workforce is most productive, creative, innovative when we have diversity. So that's something that we need to foster in our student population because the only way to have a diverse workforce is to have a diverse academic force. So, as a current student or a practicing genetic counselor, there are ways that we can be proactive with what we're doing and contributing so that we can hopefully preserve and expand on the diversity that's in our field already. Um, so, attending this webinar was one of them. I'm really glad to see some genetic counselors on here trying to learn more about what you can do and just kind of learn the lay of the land and what's going on right now with admissions, especially if you're not already affiliated with a program. This is kind of the only outlet that I have found to be able to disseminate this information. I know it's not widely available or talked about. And I think that's true for all programs, not just genetic counseling programs. It's really hard to know what's going on behind the scenes when you're not involved. So some ways that we can get involved and be part of the prosperity for diversity, equity, and inclusion in our field is by expanding our recruitment pathways. So outreach in our community, specifically to middle schools or high schools, and HBCUs is a really big one that, we know that outreach in those areas can help us promote diversity in our student population and get people interested in genetic counseling. And also just improving access to genetic counseling experiences in general. So I'm sure all of the prospective students on this call can empathize with how hard it is to have a shadowing experience or an internship or a mentorship. There are a lot more people who want to be genetic counselors than opportunities like that exist. So by not being affiliated with a program, we can sort of reserve that space to say this is how we're contributing to DEI in our field is we're reserving some of those experiences for underrepresented students or students who would have a harder time accessing those experiences in general. Part of that might be through engagement in organizations that are already targeting DEI in our field. So there'll be some resources that I provide at the end, but we know that there are organizations that exist specifically for minority students, underrepresented students, students who speak other languages, undocumented students, things like that. But there are also organizations that weren't necessarily created to promote DEI, but we have to be the ones to say how we want to incorporate that. So if you have a state association, so a local chapter of NSGC or a society of genetic counselors in your state, even though the purpose of that organization wasn't necessarily to promote DEI, there's always ways that you can sprinkle that through everything else that you're already doing. Like some states, for example, they'll have mentorship programs that are specifically for underrepresented students and matching them up with a genetic counselor who either has backgrounds like them or has the opportunity to share some of those resources like shadowing, informational interviews, and other skills that will benefit them going into interviews and applications. And then the one I think is most important and also the easiest to do is to seek out CEUs that are diversity based. So DEI training, addressing supervisor bias, so you can foster an inclusive environment for current students and prospective students. All of those things are really helpful when it comes to things that we can do now. So I'm sure that you're all very curious about what these state laws are that we've been talking about and making this big fuss about. So I will say we're not going to go through any state-specific information because one, laws vary so greatly between states, even between programs within the same state. They're not going to necessarily be handled the same way. Part of it is up to the university to interpret that law in their legal department. So that would be just way too much for us to undertake and go through in one webinar. Also, a lot of states have not yet passed this legislation. It's still pending, and pending bills can change before they're signed into law, or we know that they can die in the House or the Senate, so they might not ever become laws. But in general, what these bills may address are things like diversity statements or the language that you can use on the website, and oral statements. So things like open houses, webinars, social media accounts, and then sometimes training or curriculum requirements are mentioned. So we'll talk a little bit more about what changes we've seen in some of these states with pending or passed legislation. If you want to know what's going on in the states where you're interested in applying to genetic counseling programs, or maybe you're interested in practicing, there will be a resource through Best Colleges that's available where you can see a live map. I don't think it's been updated in a few months, but based on what I saw last Monday, I think it's mostly up to date. And then, of course, if you have program specific questions, the best person to ask about that is going to be somebody in the program. And then one thing that we'll cover is that it might be overwhelming, or it might seem like we're kind of doom and gloom about these laws, but really this is meant to be the opposite, because we do want to emphasize that training or practicing in a state with stricter laws, whether it's about DEI regulations or in admissions or not, can actually sometimes lead to skills that you didn't realize might be beneficial for your practice later on. So this is what Best Colleges looks like. It's color coded, and then it has a list of information for each of those states to say where they're at with their legislation process, and it helps to summarize the bills, and it links out to them as well. But just to summarize it for y'all really briefly, we know that there are 32 states with genetic counseling programs. 9 states previously did not have affirmative action protections. So there are 16 states that have not introduced new bills. So they do not have state-specific legislation. They just follow what the Supreme Court decided. So those states that previously did not have any affirmative action regulations, and states that have not introduced their own legislation, you're probably not going to see major changes with websites, application materials, what's talked about in webinars, what's available for you about their DEI efforts. We would expect the more, not necessarily drastic changes, but the more noticeable changes to potentially be in states where bills have been proposed, even though they have not been passed and they're no longer pending. That doesn't mean that they might not in the future. Bills that are pending, so they still have the chance to be signed into law, whether or not they're edited or revised before that happens. And then, of course, there are a few states that have passed legislation that talks about DEI or diversity in the admissions process. So those states are probably going to have more noticeable changes to their processes. Some genetic counseling programs, even in states that have not yet passed legislation, have already adapted their practices in response to the Supreme Court decision. And adjustments can include things like alteration to their diversity statements on their websites. They might have renamed or revamped either their match tracks, or potentially some funding that has usually been put aside for students of underrepresented backgrounds. For the most part, it really just depends on what the university considers being used for admissions. And like I said, that does vary from program to program, even within the same state, regardless of what the state-specific legislation looks like. But what I have noticed after talking to a lot of genetic counselors in a lot of different states is that If a program already had that unwavering commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our field, that is going to remain unchanged. That's not going to be impacted by whatever legislation is going on. I think it's really important to note that a lot of these bills do have exemptions that are available. So basically, even in the strictest scenario, there is a piece of that bill that says if complying with these laws would cost a program its academic accreditation, then you can apply for an exemption, which is something that some programs are looking into potentially. It just really depends on the state and what the legislation looks like, but it's not the end all be all. It doesn't mean that DEI is going to go away. Programs that were already champions of DEI, a mandate's not going to stop that from happening. And then conversely, if a program, maybe wasn't as vocal about their DEI efforts before, or if, that dedication wasn't something that you're seeing online, um, whether or not they're in a state with this regulation, we wouldn't expect that to change if it wasn't already there. So how can you use that information? And I know that a lot of that was just scratching the surface because, like I said, I am not legal counsel. I'm not here to give legal advice, but I just want y'all to be aware of what is happening and what the landscape looks like, and then how to use that information for this year's application cycle, because this is happening really fast. It's not lost on us that the first application is due in 2 days. So it is a really quick turnaround time, and a lot of these things you might have already considered, you might have already had these conversations, but they're just things to think about and just keep on your mind while you're going through either this application cycle or a future application cycle, or while you're helping students navigate those things. So the first thing that we really wanted to point out is that you might notice if you're a reapplicant or if you were thinking about applying last year and you decided not to and you're applying this year, is that you might not be asked specifically to write a diversity statement in some programs in states with these restrictions. But a lot of schools are moving towards resilience essays and they're supplemental. So it's a really good platform for you to be able to emphasize what makes you a unique candidate. So we say, take advantage of those supplemental essays. You also might need to dig a little bit deeper on the website and look beyond just what's on the surface. So if you're not finding specific DEI information on a program's website, don't be discouraged, and definitely do not assume that it doesn't exist or that that program doesn't support or promote DEI. You might have to seek out additional sources like open houses, webinars, and then one-on-one conversations, like informational interviews, and just kind of work a little bit harder to uncover the information that you're after. So when it comes to questions specifically about DEI efforts, because of this legislation, in some states, depending on what the law says, it might impact how openly programs can talk about these things. So what we say is, you would be surprised at how available program leadership is. So reach out to program coordinators, reach out to admissions directors, or even program directors, and let them know you want to conduct a phone call or a video call and you want to have a live conversation, and pick their brain about how DEI is woven into their program. That way you have the best chance at getting a complete and comprehensive answer. Programs are eager to share that information with you guys, and it's not something that, programs are definitely not happy with the state legislation if they are in a state that has those really strict laws. But even the strictest laws, like we said, there are ways to get around it. So they will tell you about their DEI efforts. Nobody who is making an effort is not going to talk about it if you ask them. They might just not be able to start that conversation on their own or on a public forum like a website. So just keep that in mind so it can help in your decision-making process. And then also feel free to leverage insights from current students and alumni. They have firsthand experience with what that program looks like and what DEI is to that program, how it's incorporated. how often it's incorporated. So current students usually have their contact information online, and then alumni can be found on LinkedIn or via findageneticcounselor.com, so the National Society of Genetic Counselors website, and they'll usually say whether student contact is welcome. So when you're thinking about how to word those questions and how to produce the answer that you're looking for, regardless of what the legislation might look like for that program or that state, just know that all programs can answer questions about certain things. So all programs can answer questions about the accreditation standards that exist. And there are actually new ACGC standards that require diversity, equity, and inclusion to be embedded in program curriculum, training, diversity statements, mission statements, all of those things. So asking questions about how programs are supporting those standards or how practice-based competencies are met. All of those things are hopefully program directors would be, able to answer those questions really easily. And then, of course, the Genetic Counselor's Code of Ethics is another source where you can find how to ask questions or how to word questions, or maybe it might be inspiration for what you think is important to you, because different things are important to different people. So there might be one aspect of those standards or those competencies or that code of ethics that really speaks to you. So it's important to find a program that if it's something that's really important to you, that it's important to them as well. And then one of the main tips or feedback that we've heard from genetic counselors is that even in states where race or other diversity dimensions can't be used as a way to admit a student into a program, skills are always fair game. So if you highlight skills that make you helpful to your patient population, like for example, if you speak more than one language because you grew up somewhere where you were speaking more than one language, being bilingual is a great skill to highlight in your personal statements or on your CV, just wherever it fits to talk about what makes you a unique candidate based on your personal experiences. So when it comes to deciding what genetic counseling programs to apply to, like I said, it's really important to go beyond just what is surface level information. So there are other ways to make sure that a program is aligning with your goals and not making assumptions just based on what's readily available. So some avenues to explore for extra support, and whether that's when you're in a program or thinking about applying to be in a genetic counseling program, you can look for states with local NSGC chapters or other genetic counselor run organizations. And then some other third-party players, they might have things like mentorships and internships, and then some financial support that can be helpful for both applicants and current students. So I think that that's really important to look at the landscape beyond just what's in that program, but also in that area, what kind of support exists for students from underrepresented backgrounds. And then when it comes to concerns about being in a state with more restrictions, and that's not just restricted to DEI in admissions or in higher education, um, the decision is really complicated and we understand that it's complex, but while there are a lot of things that you need to weigh, there are some benefits, like you'll understand how to navigate a legal landscape in a way that you might not if you were to train or practice in a state that didn't have those same restrictions. So if you ever practice in a state or go and you're in a situation where you have to utilize those skills, you'll be ready, you'll be fully prepared for that. So it might be easier to go from a state with more restrictions to a state with fewer restrictions, potentially whenever you're thinking about where to land for your career. And then also just consider that there are patients in those locations that might be more hostile to these things like DEI, reproductive justice, and patients can't always seek care elsewhere. So somebody has to be there to provide those medical genetic services. And if this is something that you're passionate about, you might be one of the best people to serve those patients. So all that to say, don't forget to consider yourself and your happiness and your health and safety, but just think about other things on the flip side of that whenever you're kind of weighing whether a program might be right for you or not. So when it comes to kind of teasing out where you fit and what you are interested in and where you might want to go, when you find a reason that a program would be a good fit for you, it's a lot easier to figure out how you'd be a good fit in that program. And so when you have both of those things, that might increase your chances of advancing through the interview process or application process, because there is something specific about that program that's motivating you. So you want to make sure that their values align with something or that your values align with what they're striving to maintain, but also that their values speak to you. So some things to consider: ask yourself, ask program leadership or current students, just to make sure that you've got a well-rounded picture. Is there something specific about their mission statement that stands out or resonates with you? Or if there is information that's lacking on the website, like you're not finding, whether it's DEI support or representation or training in some way, shape, or form, don't just assume that that doesn't exist. Take those next steps, like contacting those people, those current students, alumni, and program leadership, to make sure that you're gaining a full understanding. And then if for some reason, like whether it's related to these DEI regulations or not, if for some reason you're not finding that information readily available on the website, there are other places that you can look that will give you clues without outright saying this is what we do to support DEI in the program. So some of those things will include current and past thesis projects that students are working on. So looking through those and seeing, are any of those related to DEI principles? Do current students talk about their DEI efforts in their bios? Because like we said, most programs have current student bios available online, whether that's on their program website or their social media accounts. Do faculty participate in research or a clinical practice or some other educational opportunity that demonstrates a commitment to DEI? So if you are super plugged in, which I know a lot of people are, and you are listening to a podcast and someone mentions that they are faculty at a program, and the topic of that podcast just happens to be something related to diversity, equity, or inclusion, it's probably a good sign, or it's something that might pique your interest and say, oh, I might want to look into that program because I know that the faculty are interested in what I'm interested in. And then one that I think might skip people's minds, or it might just be overlooked, is what courses are promoting DEI. So is there something very obvious on the website? If not, you can always ask how DEI is incorporated into the curriculum. You can use the verbiage that we talked about before. So saying which standards, which DEI standards are being incorporated into what courses that stand out the most. And then, of course, something that you need to consider is, will you feel safe and healthy living in that state? I heard someone say that almost anybody can do anything for 2 years. But when you like where you live and you're happy with where you're at, the specific location, it does make grad school a little bit easier on the days where it's tough. So don't put yourself last, put yourself first, but make sure that you're making an informed decision and that you've explored all those avenues, whenever you're trying to decide if that's a right place for you or not. So these are some of the links to the organizations that I had mentioned that are specifically there to support students from underrepresented backgrounds. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are some of the main ones where I would encourage you to start, or it might give you an idea of what to look for. If you've already looked into these, when you Google them, you can Google a lot of the same language and it might pull up just other organizations that exist. And then a big thing that I like to promote is mentorship within our field. So whether it's through a program, whether it's through a local association or a society of genetic counselors. There are mentorship programs that exist specifically to support underrepresented students. And even if those mentorship programs, if that's not their purpose, I still encourage everybody to try to get connected with a mentor, and you can specify that you know, want somebody from a similar background. So if you're a first generation college student, or if you're bilingual, or if you live in this area, you know, it doesn't hurt to ask. And if a mentorship organization or program has a mentor that fits that, they're going to try to get you in touch with it. And if not, your mentor might know somebody who does. Um, So I will pause for questions, and then I have a few more references at the end. I believe that this presentation will be going up on the GC Prep YouTube, so it'll be available for reference. But if you want a copy of these slides to be able to click any of these links, feel free to contact me at that email address. I am gonna give just another minute in case anybody, or just a few more seconds if anybody wants to take down my contact information. And then if you have any questions, if you'll put them in the chat, and then I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can see the chat as well, and so that you guys can see me. And Cooper, if you haven't already, I can't see the chat. So if you would paste my email address in there, that would be great.
Yes, I just put them in there. So far, there's no questions yet.
Okay. And that's okay. That was a lot of information. Okay. And I will, I think I can put myself there. I am happy to take any questions. You can also send them to Cooper privately, I think. There should be an option whenever you go to the chat bar to send it to her privately, or to me privately, or to Michaela privately. Happy to answer those offline if you include your contact information. But if anybody has anything that they want to add to that, I'm also very happy to take additional information if you happen to be an expert in DEI legislation or applications or admissions. Thanks, Cheryl.
There is a question, it looks like. I'm not going to say the name since it came to me privately, so I'm just going to read it out loud. They asked, where did your passion for DEI come from? And how has your passion impacted others in your area?
That's a good question. So I don't know if I can really answer where it came from. I don't know that I had a specific instance where I was like, this is somewhere where I see myself going. I think for a lot of us, it just kind of naturally happens this way. I have always been really passionate about helping prospective students. And even when I was a student, I was helping people that I was passing my GCA reins off to. I was talking to them about genetic counseling programs. So I think that that's probably where it stems from, is that I really care about more people wanting to be genetic counselors. And I recognize that a big piece of that is trying to get more representation so that our workforce looks like the populations that we're serving. We want people who can relate to all of our patients, and people, I don't know if anybody has seen the short, I think it's a Pixar short. It's called Pearl, where the workforce is literally just all businessmen, and this little ball of yarn comes in, and it really, like, you see a difference. And I think it's a really cute short way to show how important it is to have people from different backgrounds and who are experts in different things and live different life experiences. And so it is sort of selfish because I'm like, those are the people that are going to be my colleagues, and they're going to help me in places where I need to be supported, and I can support them back. So I'm very happy to do that. I think there was a second part to that question, unless I've already answered it, Cooper, and then I'll move on to the next one.
The other part was, how has your passion impacted others in the area?
A lot of the people on this call right now are colleagues of mine, so classmates or coworkers or just genetic counselors that I've been connected with. So I'd like to think that I'm pretty good at persuading people to participate in a lot of these efforts. And you'll learn to, if you're not already a genetic counselor, if you're a future genetic counselor, you'll learn that um, people who you care about, they care about the things that you care about. So it's usually pretty easy to get your classmates at least to help out with these things. Um, and then I got one private message, so let me read that really quick. I was asking about international students and admissions. So I will say anecdotally, I had not heard any impact on international students, and whether or not those like admissions processes would change. I would imagine the only changes that you're going to see are the same ones that are happening university wide for whatever program you're applying to. And then potentially, I will say that most institutions that are being affected are going to be public institutions, but there are some private institutions that are making changes or are in states where there are these regulations, so they might in the future make changes. So I will say that no scholarships, from what I could find, so no funding has been removed. It just could be that the parameters for who qualifies for that funding might change a little bit to just be in compliance with those laws. And Cooper, what's the next one?
Yeah, the next one says, if we want to make changes in DEI as prospective students, where should we start? And then the second part of the question is, are there any DEI/GC advocacy groups you know of that we can join?
Good questions. So I am not sure which of those organizations allow prospective students to be members, but I think all of them, if not most of them. And Michaela, you might know a little bit better than me, but I believe that most of those organizations do have a place for prospective students. Because they're mostly, it's not genetic counselor specific, it's genetics professionals. Um, and then if you want to make a change as a prospective student, if you're talking about like an outward change, I would say just get connected in your area and you'll very quickly learn um, where you fit best or where you can use your skills most. So if you're somebody who is a really hands-on person, you might want to volunteer for something that is boots on the ground, supporting communities that don't necessarily get the same funding or the same attention as other communities or neighborhoods in your area. And then, of course, advocacy is another big thing. So, getting connected with those programs, or kind of like what we did here, this was just a group of genetic counselors who had something that they wanted other people to know about. Um, and just networking is a big thing because if you care about something and you can find other people that care about it, it's really easy to reach others. It's not really easy to reach a lot of others, but we do know that you can spread that through word of mouth and on social media as well. And if there's not something that speaks to you, you can always start an organization. We definitely don't have enough. And there used to be one for current students, but I don't necessarily think that they're active anymore.
There is another question in there too.
Sure.
Unless you have any other thoughts. I didn't want to cut you off.
No, no, that's
okay. Well, I guess this one just came directly to me, but I'll read that. It says, historically, GC programs have not done well in addressing DEIJ. Do you really think things will change? If yes, what are GC programs really doing to address DEIJ?
I think that's a fair question. I can't speak for any program on the specifics of what they're doing because I'm not affiliated with any specific genetic counseling program. I do know that I've heard through word of mouth about some of the changes that people are making. And if you look at the GC field or the GC programs as a whole, a lot of the GC field DEIJ work has come about very strongly in the last few years. So that's not lost on us. We're very aware that you know, kind of very briefly before COVID, there was a really big push for DEIJ in genetic counseling. And I never think it's a bad thing to have a push like that. I don't think that that is wrong. I think, in a perfect world, would that have always been the case? And would people have always been that passionate about promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, belonging, all of those things in our field? Yeah, in a perfect world, we would have been able to do that. But I do think that I personally have noticed efforts from, I can speak to my experience at the University of South Carolina. When I started there as a first year, not that I know of, I don't think we had a DEI committee. By the time I was the second year, they'd created one, and that's a standing committee that still exists to this day. And they've created that mentorship program specifically for students of underrepresented backgrounds. And those were all changes that I witnessed in my 2 short years there. So to say what those programs are doing, when we're not involved every day, it's really hard. And I'm sure if you're not associated with a genetic counseling program, it can almost seem invisible. But if you want to know, the best way to find out is ask. And if you feel like they're not doing enough, you know, they're not going to say no to suggestions. They're going to do what they can do, whether that's student organizations or another effort. But if you feel like they could be doing something more, it could just be something that they haven't thought about yet. So I say give that feedback if you have it.
If I can chime in here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is tricky. No school is going to be like, we don't support DEI, right? No school is going to come out and say that. And I don't think any genetic counselor necessarily would say that. But there are varying degrees of dedication to that, and also varying degrees of what a counselor might think is an acceptable level of enactment, right? And that might not always be what we want to see for that program. So if you're a prospective student and you're wondering, how is this really playing out at this particular program, I would strongly encourage you to try to talk to some of their current students or recent graduates. So whether that's going to the program website and trying to find some of their current students, or asking the program leadership to put you in touch with some of their current or previous students who would fall into the underrepresented group that you are interested in. That's probably where you're going to get more of the behind the scenes information, like how accepting was this program of you, how supportive of your ideas are they really putting into practice what they say they're going to? Because ultimately, all programs want to put like their best foot forward when it comes to trying to recruit students, right? And now there's, in some cases, limitations of what they can say on their websites. Also, if you are a prospective student and you have not already seen it, the Exeter study came out a few years ago on like the field of genetic counseling in general and how conscious we are of DEI topics. And spoiler alert, the outcome was not as positive as many genetic counselors thought it would be. There's an abbreviated or like summarized version that's still about 30 pages that's available on the NSGC website, as well as a webinar that the then president of NSGC gave on the findings, which you're welcome to watch and read and interpret however you'd like to. But at least for me, it was eye-opening to read that study and just see beyond the experience that I personally was having as a genetic counselor, as a, straight, white, cis-identifying genetic counselor, what were the other experiences that people who are approaching the field and in the field saying about how they're being included and listened to and kind of supported in the field. So if you haven't used that resource already, I would highly recommend it.
Thanks. Thank you, Michaela. That was great.
There is a second part to the question that came through when you guys were sharing. they said, I have listened to several GC informational webinars. In general, they state that DEIJ is interwoven in the curriculum. Most cite a DEIJ journal. What are your thoughts?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of that question? All I heard was journal.
Oh, yeah. It says, in general, they state that DEIJ is interwoven in the curriculum. Most cite a DEIJ journal. What are your thoughts?
I think I might not be understanding the question correctly. To me, it sounds like they are referencing a journal, and I'm so sorry. I can't tell if this is probably my sick brain. If that's like a peer-reviewed journal that they're referencing or sending people to, or if it's like they keep a DEIJ journal. Whoever asked that question, are you able to clarify to Cooper what you mean? Or if somebody's familiar with the DEIJ journal, definitely let me know.
It says they keep a DEIJ journal.
I'm not familiar with that. I don't think that we did that at our program when we were there. So I don't have experience with that. I don't even I can't even really imagine what that might look like in my mind, but it sounds like if you have reservations about that, that's always a good thing to bring up because like I said, when you're having these informational or these formal interviews, you're interviewing them to make sure that they're a good fit for you just as much as it's the other way around. So if that's not adequate, like if that's not something that you are okay with or satisfied with, then, do it professionally. But I think it's okay to say, in addition to that DEIJ journal, what else? Like, can you give me specific examples or what courses are, most heavily interwoven with DEIJ principles and in what way? Are the guest lecturers people of color or people of underrepresented backgrounds in genetics? Are the supervisors, are we hearing or seeing pictures from the patient perspective that are not all, like Michaela mentioned, the majority, which is straight, white, cis, female? So all of those questions I think are fair to ponder. Sometimes they might be better digested by current students because they're getting the most up-to-date information. But it's definitely not a bad thing to be wondering about.
They mentioned, thanks for the clarification, very insightful and helpful.
Yeah. Okay. And then I got a direct message that said DA journaling has been implemented in many programs and then shared in a group setting as students are willing for discussion and awareness. So I guess we did have a journal club. We didn't keep like a specific journal for us, but we did have a journal club where we did discuss DEI in our field or in genetics in general. So I guess we did do a group discussion about that. But yeah, we didn't have to keep a journal. I think it's a good idea. I like journaling, but it kind of just depends on how people are participating, I guess. And then we're just approaching 2 minutes until the 30 minutes. So if anybody has last minute questions, like I said, if you put your contact information in the direct message, I'm happy to follow up with you offline. But other than that, thank you so much for, attending and participating in all of your really great questions. I'm glad that I was even able to learn something after having this webinar too. So I really appreciate it, y'all.
Thank you so much, Jackie. We will go ahead and end here. The webinar should be posted on GC Prep's YouTube page and also on our homepage in the next day or so, and we'll send out some notifications on social media and emails to let people know when that's available. So feel free to contact Jackie or myself, support@gcprepllc.com, to be put in touch with her if needed. Okay, thank you guys so much for coming.
Thanks, Michaela.